Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review of the Sony FE 100-400mm F4.5-5.6 G Master lens, and this has their OSS or optical steady shot system. I'll be making some comparisons to a lens that I'm very familiar with at this point, and that is Canon's EF 100-400mm L Mark II, which in many ways shares a lot of design philosophy and features with this lens, and also it provides a really good optical benchmark, as the Canon has been one of the very best lenses at this particular focal range, and so I like it as a benchmark. And so anyway, we'll explore that more in just a few minutes. Now, a few months back, I reviewed a newer lens from Sony, not a G Master, but the 200-600mm G OSS lens. And so I will also be drawing some remarks to this, because I suspect there are at least some of you that are considering cross-shopping the two lenses. And so I'll circle back to that in the end in our wrap-up and discuss, who I think should consider either of the two lenses. Now today we're here to do the definitive review, which means we're going to go into detail in terms of the build, the handling, the autofocus performance, the image quality. And so if you don't want all of those details, you want more of the highlights and the conclusions, then take a look at the standard review that will give you the information you're looking for without all of the nitty-gritty. But if you're into the nitty-gritty like me, you're in the right place. This is the right review for you. And so without any further ado, let's jump in and let's take a look at build, handling, and feature set of this particular lens. So today we're going to take a closer look. So let's take a closer look at the 100-400mm here. Now I thought it'd be kind of interesting to have as a point of comparison the slightly older, they're not terribly different, a few years apart in age, but the Canon 100-400 L Mark II, which I'm very familiar with because I've owned it for a number of years. Very, very close to after its introduction. And so there's a lot of actually shared design elements as a part of this. For example, the Canon was the first that I saw to have this smooth and tight type ring as a means of either increasing or reducing friction on the zoom ring. And so if you want to be able to zoom really easy, you go to the smooth, and then you can tighten it down to where it almost, instead of a lock, you can kind of lock it at any point. So the GM lens actually shares that, and and they call it the same kind of thing, smooth and tightening type ring. And so it operates in a similar fashion. At the smoothest point, it's not quite as smooth as the Canon. There's a little bit of a pumping action that's there that the Canon is a little more refined on. Let me go to that. And so so you have a little bit more control over how much friction is there with the Canon as opposed to the GM lens. But as you can see, that's a shared design element to be sure. Another shared design element is you have very similar type buttons here. And so both an AF/MF switch, you've got a focus limiter with 2 positions and the same restrictions, either full or 3 meters to infinity. And then you have got some controls for the steady shot here, or the IS on the Canon, and you have got modes. Now in the case of the Canon, you actually have 3 modes as opposed to 2 modes on the Sony. But again, you have very, very similar kind of feature set. Now something that is more unique to Sony is the fact that you have 3 positions of the focus hold button. And so that can be programmed to a variety of functionality within the camera body, and of course is very useful. And of course the reason why you have it at different positions is so basically whatever position you have the camera rotated onto, you'll be able to have a button at hand there. I find that I don't look to the focus hold buttons as often now that we have real-time, full-time IAF. That was kind of my main function for it, but certainly it's nice to have, and you may be able to find different functionality that works best for you. So other shared design elements are the fact that both of these lenses can focus down to the same minimum focus or minimum focus distance of 0.98 meters, right under a meter, or 2.96 feet, right under 3 feet. And so while both of them can focus down to the same distance, the Sony actually has a slightly higher magnification of 0.35 versus 0.31 times. Now, while both of those are extremely useful, I mean, you're with the Sony, you're past 1/3 size life size, which is very useful for a variety of purposes. The difference here, however, comes down to the fact that the Canon definitely does some focus breathing, where it doesn't behave like a full 400 millimeters at close focus distances, whereas the Sony behaves a little bit more so. And so I find that the framing at those closer focus distances, this definitely frames a little bit tighter than what does the Canon, which explains that difference in that particular figure. Both of these lenses have a fluorine coating up front, and so that helps with fingerprints and or moisture. It is part of the design here that starts with a gasket here at the lens mount. And like all the gaskets I've seen basically for the Sony mount, they're not as robust for whatever reason as what you see on DSLRs. Like here you can really get a feel of that, and it may just have something to do with the actual nature of the mount. But here it is just, it's there, but it doesn't really, it's almost like a flush gasket that's a part of that. It is a part of 17 different seal points within the lens itself. And so that includes at the rings, at the switches, the buttons, and other transition points in the lens. Both of them have a, kind of a similar body, primarily a lightweight metal that's part of the body. And so that does set them apart a little bit. The Sony is actually a little bit longer. It comes in at 205 millimeters or a little right over 8 inches, whereas the Canon comes in at 7.6 inches or 193 millimeters. And so an 8 millimeter difference. It doesn't look quite like that if you have the lens caps on, but that's because the Sony lens caps are so low profile compared to the Canon that if you actually put the bare lenses side by side, you see that difference. Now, in terms of the difference when they're fully extended, and so you can see that the Sony kind of retains the same basic difference in overall height when it is fully extended. Now, the Canon seems to have a slightly more robust build to it, and that is reflected in the weight. The weight comes in at 1,640 grams, or 3.6 pounds for the Canon, whereas the Sony is a more svelte 1,395 grams, or 49 ounces. And so there's definitely a fairly significant, almost 250 gram difference between the two lenses in weight, which makes the Sony obviously a little bit more portable by comparison. Again, the similarities in the design elements come up to the hood. Both of these hoods have the window that allows you to, for example, rotate a circular polarizer. They both come with a focus lock. And so I think that the Sony one feels a little bit more premium, and it has one design element that I appreciate, and that is a rubberized surface here. And so that's always welcome because, the most often place if you have a camera attached to set this down is going to be in this. It's the most stable position. This you end up tipping, and so, but in this position, it's nice and stable. That also gives us a chance to look at the tripod collars, which are also kind of a similar design. They're fully rotatable. However, the full tripod collar doesn't come off. It's just this section of it that will come off. And so in the case of the Sony, there's a knob here that you have to loosen. And then there's underneath, you can't really see it here, but there is a release button that completes that. And so if you're not using it, if you're just using it handheld and you don't want the foot to stay out of the way, you can remove that and save yourself a little bit of weight. Don't expect it to be a night and day difference, however, but that is the aspect of the tripod collar that is removable. Now, unfortunately, the tripod collar here is not Arca-Swiss compatible, which means you can't just connect it to a tripod. I have no idea why that is, why they would persist with that. It certainly, to me, is a design element that I think is important. And so you are going to have to add a quick release plate to that. The same is true on the Canon, unfortunately. Both of these have a 77mm front filter thread. Both have 9 rounded aperture blades. The Sony is Slightly more complex, 22 elements in 16 groups compared to 21 elements in 16 groups, but as you can see, their overall performance is very similar. One difference, however, is that the Sony clocks in at about $300 more expensive, at right under $2,500 compared to right at about $2,200 for the Canon. So of course I've made a comparison to a lens that I consider to be the best at this, to me has been kind of the standard at this particular focal length. And so the fact that the Sony is very similar in terms of its feature set is, to me, is a positive thing because it's matching up well, I think, with the very best. And really there's nothing that the Canon has that this Sony lens does not have, other than there is, the biggest difference is one extra mode for the image stabilization on the Canon. However, the Sony gives you the focus hold button, which gives you some other options that you can map to it through the lens body. But a lot of good things going on here. It's a very usable lens. It's a very usable package. And I think that for this kind of focal length, it remains reasonably compact. It's not overly heavy. In fact, in this case, you definitely have a significant weight savings as compared to the Canon. And so considering that you are typically shooting on lighter bodies when you're shooting on the Sony side, I think that that is appropriate and it's a nice pairing. I think probably the most compelling reason to consider this mounted on a Sony body like an A9 or even an A7R Mark IV is why it would be worth considering over the Canon lens on, say, a 5D Mark IV or something similar. Now, this may change once the upcoming R5 camera comes out for mirrorless bodies, but then again, you're going to have to use the Canon via adapter. But at the moment, the big advantage here is when it comes to autofocus performance. So Sony has actually executed a kind of a dual motor approach to this, basically beefed up linear motors, but in a paired system to where they can really quickly make autofocus changes. And much like what I saw on the 200-600G lens, this really, if you mount it on an A9 or an A9 II or an A7R IV, it really is a focusing dream, even for that matter, an A7 III. I mean, the lens just really sings in terms of the autofocus speed and accuracy. And for tracking action, this lens and the 200-600 are just a real delight. And they are easy to use in a way that almost feels like cheating by comparison to what I'm accustomed to. It's just so easy to lock on and retain focus. And as you can see through these sequences, I got my friend that owns Jengar Goldens, and so she brought some dogs over for me to do some runs with and to track. And once again, I was just incredibly impressed by how well tracking handled on the A9 and how I was able to get just repeatably well-focused shots. And so it makes it just a real joy to use. And that combined with PET IAF really delivers, it allows you to take advantage of the optics. And here's the thing, sometimes there's some lenses that are really good optically, but if they're manual focus lenses, for example, it's going to be more unique situations where you can get that performance. And if they don't have a great autofocus system, the same really is true, that you don't have as many opportunities for those optics to shine. In this case, when you pair it with the right camera, you're able to get the best out of the lens. And so speaking of that best, let's explore here how that the image quality actually holds up as a benchmark compared to the Canon. So let's jump in and let's take a look at that. So let's take a look at some of our basic metrics, including vignette and distortion. And so here at 100 millimeters, what we see is a very, very mild amount of pincushion distortion. And you can see there's definitely some vignette, particularly in the corner and corner thirds it comes out. You can see, of course, that it corrects simply via either the in-camera profile for JPEGs and video and or the software correction for RAW files. Not a big deal here. Likewise, at 400 millimeters, really the pattern is not all that different. There is also a pincushion distortion here, but not a major amount. And it's kind of a similar degree of vignette. And so you can see, once again, it corrects perfectly. Also worth noting, this shows you the Canon that I'm using as the benchmark, 100-400 millimeter. And so you can see here that without correction, it actually has a far more significant amount of vignette at the very least. Distortion is not all that different, but certainly vignette is much more recognizable here. So first, globally, the lighting is a little bit different here, although I used my same lights, but because of the length of this lens, I had to move from my typical testing space out into the garage. And so there's more ambient light, and so the whole chart looks a little bit more washed out, but it will allow us to, it seems like for whatever reason, it really caused a cutout of my areas where I look here, different surfaces, I guess, that are that absorb the light rather than reflect it. So anyway, it's gonna work out fine for our testing purposes. So what we find here is that at 200%, you can see that at 100mm f4.5, we've got a good looking result, good contrast, strong performance there. Looking up here, you can see that the fine details here that really kind of show up on this Canadian bill are they're really nicely rendered, and contrast you can see looks good. And then here we can see it kind of an even performance as we move off towards the edge, and then down in the corner we can see also a good performance, good contrast, good resolution. So again, for a benchmark, we'll look at the Canon. Now for whatever reason, I didn't manage to get the aperture fully wide open here, so we have a third stop variance here. Probably not enough to make much of a difference, but anyway, I did want to note that, and so all the rest of you don't comment to me telling me I missed it. So what we can see is that really in the center of the frame, the two lenses look more similar than different. Ditto here at this quadrant here. I would say that at this point, I think the Sony lens has ever so slightly more contrast there. And looking here, I think the same is true, just a little bit darker in the darks and then a little bit brighter in the brights. And so a good, good performance from both lenses. Here in this area, again, I think the contrast of the Sony is favored a little bit. By the way, the Canon is mounted via the Sigma MC11 for this. Not that it really matters as long as it's an adapter, good adapter, which it is. In the corner, the same is true, that I just find a little bit more contrast for the Sony at 100mm. Now comparing the Sony at f4.5 to f5.6, we can see that there is a further boost in contrast here in the bottom corner of the frame, and our center bill portion. You can see that it's really not all that different here. We'll look up to the Canadian Prime Minister. And again, I don't really see much of improvement there. It's mostly a corner performance improvement that I see. As far as these areas, the rest of the frame, I really don't see much of a difference. So if we move on to the 200mm point, we can see that once again, a very similar type performance, good contrast, very good resolution in the center of the frame. And likewise here, you can see, fine details are rendered very, very nicely. Contrast looks really, really good. Maybe a hair less strong than at 100mm, but I would say overall very similar. Similarly here, and then finally let's jump down into the bottom. And we can see, also a very strong performance here, just a little bit less resolution and contrast than 100mm. So one thing that's worth noting between the GM lens and then the Canon, which I've got here on the right, is that the Canon has a little bit of an aperture advantage here throughout the range, in that it doesn't go to the smaller apertures as quickly. Here we see that we're already at maximum aperture of f5.6 by, actually before 200mm, whereas the Canon at 200mm is still holding f5. So anyway, just worth a peek there. Now, what I see here comparing the two lenses is a very slight contrast advantage for the Canon lens here. And then looking at this area, I would say that the center of the frame advantage is not as pronounced here. And contrast, if anything, favors the Sony a little bit at this point. You can see that a bit here looking at the center of the frame. Moving down to the US $2 bill, again, contrast looks a little bit better on the Sony lens, and then down into the corner. Here I would say the Canon gives us a little bit brighter performance in the corner, and so I kind of like its look a little bit better. Stopping on down to f8, so a full stop stepping down on the Sony, gives us slightly better corner contrast, but it's not a significant difference. Here, again, like as before, I don't really see the difference elsewhere so much. Maybe the slightest bit here, but I don't think you would notice it without them side by side. And so basically you're getting pretty close to maximum performance wide open there at 200mm. So at 400mm, which is arguably the most important part, because that's, particularly where you're going to see it with an extender attached, which unfortunately I don't have on hand. But what I see here is a very good center performance at 400 millimeters. I see very good performance here as well, good contrast, maybe a tiny bit less contrast, but very, very close to what we've seen. A little bit less resolution here out at the, toward the mid, last bit of the mid 2/3, and then in the corner performance actually looks really, really crisp once again. So a nice performance there. So how does it compare to the Canon as the benchmark? In the center of the frame, looks like the Canon has a little bit higher contrast at 400 millimeters, and I would say you can see that also here where the Canon looks a little bit sharper. You can see it's resolving, look at the lips, you can see some of those fine details rendered that are missing there. Also, if you look at the text of Wilfred Laurier here, you can see that there's less contrast and it's clearer on the Canon lens. Likewise here, better contrast at 400 millimeters, and you can definitely see a difference in the mid-frame area, and then down here, better contrast here as well. So Canon gets the win, 400 millimeters wide open. Now, if you stop down to f8, you can see here that there really isn't a significant difference. And if anything, it actually looks like there's a tiny bit less contrast in some of the writing, which is kind of an interesting thing. This is a lens that seems to be optimized for wide open performance pretty much, and stopping it down is not really giving us much of an advantage anywhere that I have checked it here in the frame. And so anyway, that's just something that's worth looking at. So to me, the real advantage of the Sony combinations is when paired with a body like the A9 in the ability to get really, really fantastic focus results that allow you to really stop action with the lens and get great looking shots, which, I mean, I shot hundreds of shots, and just look at how, you can just stop motion so easily with great focus and great end results. And so it's more to me about kind of these real world results that make a lens like this worthwhile. Not so much shooting test charts. I mean, obviously that sharpness is important, but it's kind of wasted if you can't actually focus and catch the action that you want. And these Sony lenses, paired with something like the A9 as I'm shooting here, really give you quite amazing results in that kind of setting, to where it's just easy to get really fantastic looking end results with them. Here's another one that it's just the moments that you capture can be, when you're shooting at 15 or 20 frames per second, these moments can be pretty amusing and great that you can catch. Now here's a shot that's a little bit more slowed down, and so we can be a little bit more evaluative of image quality. So at a pixel level, you can see it's nice and crisp here, a nice and clean result. And you can see as we go towards the out of focus areas with the snow and this high contrast, I'm not really seeing any pronounced chromatic aberrations at any of these transition areas. And so, this is a strong lens optically. So I'm going to show you kind of worst case then best case, ish bokeh results. And so here you can see this shot where almost everything is in what we call the transition zone. Nothing is really completely out of focus. And in this looks a little bit jittery to me, sometimes called nervous. You can just see it's busier than what you would like. Now, on our subject, it looks great. I mean, so that's all, great stuff right there. However, the bokeh here is not fantastic. And that's true if you look in the foreground here too. It's the same kind of jittery quality. Now in this situation, I think the bokeh looks a lot nicer, nice and crisp on our end result. It still has more outlining than what I would like, and so I'm not sure that this lens gives us better bokeh than what did the 200-600 millimeter, but it just gives you an idea. I do like the look of the image overall, but if you get kind of caught up in some of these details, the bokeh is still a little bit jittery from it. And so I'm going to say that the Canon gives you, just from having a lot of experience, I've owned that lens and used it for many years, I would say that it gives you a little bit better performance in this regard. I got a really nice moon shot with the lens one night, and so as you can see, nice and crisp results on the moon. And so this is only at 400 millimeters, which is really not all that long if you're shooting the moon, but at the same time, it's a good end result. So finally, let's take a look at flare results. So as you can see, I kind of use worst case scenario with it right up in the corner of the frame. So you can see some localized veiling and prismatic haze Down here you can see some ghosting patterns, not terrible, however, at 100 millimeters. Stop down, they become a little bit more pronounced, as you can see, and so that area that's affected grows a little bit. It's a similar kind of pattern at 400 millimeters, though frankly, the kind of situations, because the angle of view is so narrow, where you would have the sun in the frame at 400 millimeters are going to be few and far between. However, just for the sake of testing, we can see kind of the same thing, a little bit of veiling where the sun is, and some ghosting down here. This, by the way, is me trying to capture the worst that I could see when panning across. And so what you can see here is more a kind of a concentrated shaft of light coming down, not so much a ghosting pattern. There could be interesting applications for this here. This is at f11. But overall, I would say flare resistance is pretty decent. So as you can see, really the lenses are highly similar. I think that the only kind of real place I saw much of a difference is that the Sony is a little bit better at 70 millimeters, the Canon is a little better at 400 millimeters. So I would say arguably the Canon is better where it matters the most, but in neither case is the difference night and day. And so I think that the Sony compares, fairly well with what is the benchmark, the best, I think, in the class. But again, the difference, at least at the moment, is that I feel like you're going to be able to get better results, real world results, probably out of the Sony combination. At least I'll put it this way, I can get better results with the Sony combination than what I've ever been able to get on the Canon combination with the Canon bodies that I've used previously. And so at this point, I'm going to reserve judgment for how I move ahead in terms of what I want in my own personal kit. But I would say that, the Sony is compelling on that front. Now, I mentioned at the beginning we would talk a little bit about the 200-600G lens. When it comes to the actual performance of the lens, I see very little to differentiate these two lenses. And in fact, I have seen some head-to-head comparisons in which there are points in the 200-600G's focal range where it's actually optically superior at different points in the frame. And so I wouldn't say that in either direction is the difference big enough to make a purchase based on that. Similarly, when it comes to performance, I would say in terms of autofocus performance, tracking ability, the 200-600G is just as good as what this lens is. And I didn't really notice a difference in real world use between the two. And so again, I wouldn't buy it based on that. Where you're going to want to make that decision is based on how you use such a lens. While there is overlap in the focal range, obviously, the 200-600 in many ways serves a different purpose than 100-400 millimeter does. This is a more flexible lens for more general purpose type shooting. It might be a better choice in some cases for sports if you don't need the greater reach, and at some points in the focal range it has a little bit of an aperture advantage, a light advantage, but I don't know that that's enough to really make that choice based on. If you really need more reach, obviously you have the option of putting an extender on this lens. Note that will get you up to 560 millimeters, howbeit at a maximum aperture of f8. And so you're actually 2/3 stop less light gathering. And so if your needs regularly extend out to 600 millimeters, I would definitely go for the 200-600 millimeter lens. It really is indistinguishable in terms of performance, even in build, really, from this lens. It's a very, very good lens, and I'm not quite sure why Sony feels that this lens deserves a G Master designation while the other deserves just a G designation, but there wasn't really anything that I could determine that set the lenses apart in terms of how they felt, how they were built, and how they performed. However, the 200-600 is a significantly larger lens, and one of the great advantages to a lens like this is the fact that it is reasonably compact. It's still a big lens, obviously, but it's reasonably compact. And so what that means is that it is easier to transport. You have more flexibility in the bag or the backpack that you can carry it in. It's going to sit in a harness or something similar more easily. And so that might be a consideration for you. And so if size and weight really matters to you, this might be an appealing option, and then throw that extender on there when you need the additional reach. However, if you really just want a dedicated wildlife lens and you're going to kind of use it, or sports, in certain situations, but if you're going to use it in the right situation to where you're focusing on bringing that lens, and so transport is not as big a deal, I would go for the 200 to 600 millimeter, and in some ways that's the more appealing option to me at this point. I really like the way that it performs. I know that such a lens, I don't reach for it often, and if I'm going to be shooting between 100 and 200 millimeter, I'm far more likely to grab something like a 70 to 200 f2.8. Now your mileage may vary, but I wanted to give you some food for thought and maybe helping to shape your process. But at the same time, I think that this is an excellent lens. I'm not sure if it's justified an additional $600 price over the 200 to 600. And of course, if you're buying an extender, you're basically going to be paying an additional $1,100 US over the 200 to 600. So that's another reason to consider that lens, is when it comes to the price. This is definitely the pricier way to go. However, it's a very good performing lens. I think that it should be priced more where the Canon is priced at. I think that that's probably a fairer price. So I do consider it to be slightly overpriced relative to performance, because it's not doing anything that the Canon doesn't. And there are, arguably the Canon is a little bit better at 400 millimeters. But food for thought. I hope that this helps you in framing your buying decision. Now, if you want more information, you can look in the description down below. I've got linkage to a full text review. Also linkage there to an image gallery if you want to look at more photos. Beyond that, of course, there are buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. And also linkage to follow me on social media, sign up for my newsletter, become a patron, all of that good stuff. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.